we're very excited to welcome Dr. Elizabeth Sawin to talk about her latest book. And we're also thrilled to have Professor John Sterman facilitating the conversation. An extra special gift to you all, we're going to be raffling 25 copies of Beth's book to attendees. So if you haven't yet scanned in on this QR code, please do so now so that we can pick some winners after this event. Sophia from our team will email all of the winners by this afternoon. So you can either come by our office to pick it up or we can mail it to you. Excellent. So without further ado, I would like to hand the microphone over to Professor John Sterman to kick off today's conversation.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Oh, that's a little loud, isn't it? We'll turn that. Can you hear me okay, Beth?
I hear you great. Hi, John.
Great, and we hear you great. So it's a special treat for me to be able to introduce my friend, Beth. I'll try to be brief, and I know Beth and I want this to be interactive, so don't hesitate to ask your questions, and I'm also welcome to our online participants today, and those folks, don't hesitate to ask your questions. So Beth first learned about system dynamics, which is a very important foundation for multi-solving as an undergraduate up at Dartmouth College, where she majored in biology and had a chance to work with Dana Meadows, who also was my mentor when I was an undergraduate some years before that. And then Beth got a PhD here at MIT in biology. So she is a serious, real scientist, but then pivoted back into the world of applying systems thinking to meaningful social and environmental issues. So how did that work? She moved back up to the Upper Valley of New Hampshire on the Connecticut River, where she was one of the founders, along with Dana Meadows, of a new intentional community called Cobb Hill. It's in Vermont, actually, which is where Beth's coming to us today. That's an intentional community that Dana and a few other core folks, including Beth and her husband, Phil Rice, and their kids, who are now very grown up, converted an old and pretty rundown dairy farm into a vibrant community that is living lightly on the land with many sustainability features and growing as much of their own food as they can while pursuing their various professional interests. Along the way, Beth co-founded, along with Drew Jones, who many of you know, Climate Interactive, the nonprofit think and do tank that's developed the C-ROADS and En-ROADS models and works on climate policy. And Beth was very effective in doing that. And that's really when we got to know each other. Well, it was before that, but, and then Beth developed Multisolving. And in 2021, left Climate Interactive to found the Multisolving Institute, which is a nonprofit that is developing the theory, compiling the examples, and facilitating and helping people all around the world to apply multi-solving in their own communities and their own practice. So there's a lot more I could say to introduce Beth, but let me just say that it's not that often we have a chance to meet someone who's not just walking the talk, but talking the walk, sharing what she's learned so that other people can benefit and learning from what all those other folks are doing. As an MIT PhD in biology, Beth is very familiar, as all of you are, with MIT's motto, mind and hand, very important. But Beth goes beyond that. She integrates mind and hand and heart. And I think this is enormously valuable. And we're just so happy to have you here today, Beth. So do you want to say anything by way of introduction, or shall I ask you the first question?
No, why don't you hit me with the first question? But thanks, that was a beautiful introduction, John.
Well, it's all, you deserve more. So I guess the first thing is, since many people have not yet read your book, tell us what multi-solving is and maybe give an example. And then I think we'd like to know, how did you get there? How did you come to this idea? What was the genesis? So what is multi-solving?
Yeah, so at Multisolving Institute, we have a three-part definition for multisolving. And the first part is the most obvious and the one that's sort of most common, which is any action or investment or policy that meets multiple needs with one effort. And we'll talk about examples that will become more clear. But for us, for multi-solving really to be effective, there's two other important components. The second one is that it meets these multiple needs in a way that also improves equity. And that could be different types of equity in different situations. It might be gender equity or economic equity or racial equity. But multi-solving and equity, and John, I have a feeling we'll talk about this more, in the way that we've come to understand it, which is really from studying people on the ground who are making such great strides, we see equity as almost always a theme. So that's something we look for in the definition. So multiple goals with one effort in a way that improves equity. The third component that we stress is operating out of a worldview that I call a web of relationships. And I contrast that to, in my book, to a worldview that's actually more prominent in our modern industrial societies, a collection of objects worldview. So a web of relationships worldview comes, systems thinking is one way to articulate it, but so are many great wisdom traditions that emphasize the wholeness of the world and our interconnection and independence with each other. So people who are multi-solving at their highest are operating in that sort of a consciousness and putting that into practice in the projects they do. So that's the definition. I think it's great you asked for examples, John, because they actually transmit this better than the definition. And I get to pick my favorite examples. The one that's coming to mind for me today actually was a response to crisis, which is a theme maybe we can talk about because so much of multi-solving actually is a response to crisis. This example comes from Japan, and it was a response to the Fukushima disaster, which created an energy crisis in Japan as the nuclear power system got turned down for safety reasons. There was a big gap in the electric supply. Energy efficiency became really important. And across Japan, many factories created what they called green curtains. So they're super simple. It's basically vegetative screens on the south side of buildings that provided shade. So they reduced the energy needed for cooling, but they used mostly edible plants, edible vines, to create these shade structures. And the food from those vines got sent into company cafeterias or sent home with employees at the end of their shifts. So you see a response to a need to reduce energy demand that would pay off in a climate change benefit. If there's less energy from fossil fuels, then there's going to be less greenhouse gas emissions. And then there's healthy and nutritious food and a little bit of a savings on people's food bills. So there you see the multiple benefits out of one effort. And often what I like to do is to ask people to think about their own examples of multi-solving now that you have the definition, something you've participated in or studied or admired. And I know here we're partly in a room together and partly online. So I would say if you're online, think of an example and put it in the chat. And if you're in the room, let's take 3 minutes, turn to a partner and share an example, and then we'll just lift a couple of those up.
Yeah, you didn't know you were going to be part of it today. So everybody should just pair off and share an example of multi-solving that you either participated in or know about in some fashion. Let's go. So you folks need to get together in the back and over here. Something where you've created or seen interventions that achieved multiple desirable goals for the participants, the communities in which they live and operate.
नहीं ना दादा कोविड हुआ तो अभी हो गया कि पहले तो एवरीबॉडी को तुमसे छुट्टी बढ़ा दिया अभी when they were to come back because we were also told that this is the time where the risk is the highest. If Pakistan takes advantage कि भैया पूरी फौज में बैठी है तो you have to get people back and keep the training also. हमने क्या किया हमने क्वारंटीन जो करा लोग आएंगे और क्वारंटीन ब्लॉक्स में 1 to 7 days इसमें 7 to 10 days इसमें and within those blocks we made training in charge and training program कि वो जो 7 दिन वाले ब्लॉक में लोग हैं वो अंदर ही अपनी ट्रेनिंग करते रहे so that continuous training is going on. क्वारंटीन भी हो रहा है और ट्रेनिंग भी चल रहा है क्योंकि बीमार तो ट्रेनिंग और ट्रेनर दोनों एक साथ हुए मेरे यूनिट में not even one COVID infection. दोनों को मिलकर ज्यादा सब not even one guy infected. हमारे को डर ये था एक बार होगा ना फौज में अगर एक बार हो जाएगा चलेगा पूरा चलेगा तो फिर लिप्स can't stay apart.
इन्होंने इसमें एग्री सोलर मतलब वो थोड़ा एक्सपेंसिव होता है आप इसको थोड़ा और एलिवेट कर देते हो ना तो जनरली क्या है 5 फुट पे रहता है उसके लेग्स जो होते हैं सोलर पैनल के नीचे जो जाते हैं तो आप डबल कर लो उससे ग्रीन हाउस इफेक्ट भी आता है नीचे सिटी करो सोलर भी जनरेट होगा तो सारे पौधे नहीं करते जो वही ग्रीन हाउस जिसको थोड़ा ग्रीन हाउस इफेक्ट चाहिए तो आप ऐसा होगा वो सब भी करते हैं वो आप नीचे वो करो दोनों फायदे
Okay, how are people doing? Y'all ready to share a little bit?
Yes.
All right, so Beth, so why don't I just get some volunteers to just speak up and who wants to share?
We have an answer from online.
Okay.
Anna said compost.
Compost.
She said because it creates healthier soils that retain more moisture and pull carbon from the atmosphere and makes more nutrient dense foods.
And keeps that waste from going into the municipal waste stream. Yeah, how many people have a compost pile? I know I do. I know Beth does. Yeah, that's great. Okay, fantastic. And how about in the room? Who's got an idea? An example? I will call people for sure. Yeah, Rodrigo.
Yeah, well, in one project that I work,
Louder.
in a project that I work up there in Chile, we decided to run the baseline studies for the project with the indigenous community. What I mean is not because the mandatory baseline with the social aspect, but we indeed was to invite indigenous communities to run with all the other aspects of the baseline, which means flora, fauna, and so on. So that multi-approach helped us, to for one hand engage with the indigenous community, build trust, because we're learning together. And the other thing was great, also as a company, we learned from there, and we got a lot of good insight for design the project. Thanks, because we invite them to look at the overall project.
Great. So can you share what the business is?
Yeah, it was a mining project.
Mining in Chile.
Yeah.
And bringing the indigenous community who lives where the mining has to take place into the process from the beginning, coming up with better solutions than your company thought of on their own.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Great.
Donna, could I just add something about that, which is another hallmark of multi-solving is in that example, it's people building bridges and connections across silos or fractures in order to accomplish multi-solving. So I hear that very much in your example. Thank you.
That's great. Other examples? We can definitely take a couple more. Yeah, please.
I have an example that's more on a consumer level. There's this company called Too Good to Go.
Too good to go.
Yeah, so the business that makes a company based on subscriptions where members can sign up for their goods and it helps restaurants and also supermarkets to manage food waste. So anything that's like leftover after this fire, that we bundle up into a package and be sent to those consumers who are subscribed to it.
Great, so this is a way to reduce the waste that goes into the solid waste stream, similar to the online suggestion about compost, but also getting food that would otherwise go to waste to people who can benefit from it. That's great. By the way, there's another startup, a Sloan founded startup called Spoiler Alert that does the same thing in more of a B2B context. So this is a great multi-solving example. I'm going to call on Levi and Celia. You want to share, Levi?
Yeah, totally. So there's the practice of raising solar panels above farms, so then you can get energy from the solar panels, but also provide shade for the plants and causes less water transpiration. So it's more effective for the plants to have the solar panels. Raising.
Great. And then where do the sheep come in, Celia, or goats?
The rented goats come in when you bring goats because you can't really mow underneath the solar panels, so they graze and clear out the grass and vegetation so that you can grow other plants and actual crops underneath.
Goats are particularly good here. Beth, you folks at Copville have sheep. I don't think you have goats. Do you have goats? I don't think so.
No goats, and solar panels, but on barn roofs, no agrivoltaics yet. But it's a great example.
One of the great things about the goats is many great things. First of all, they eat poison ivy, which is great. They also can mow slopes that are far too steep to mow with machinery. And that brings down the fire hazard in places like California and, well, pretty much everywhere now that faces wildfire risk. So there's a lot of wonderful multi-solving there. Yeah, go ahead.
So examples of passive cooling, so like using, and this is one of the experiments that we run in India, where we covered cow shelters with and specially engineered paints, which helped keep the temperature under the roof cool, but also led in increase in milk production because of reduction in thermal stresses in the cows.
Fantastic example. This is great. Well, Beth, comments?
Oh, this is always my favorite part of any conversation, because multi-solving is all around us. A few times we've been funded by different philanthropies to do scans for multi-solving, and we find it everywhere we look, every continent, every scale, from neighborhood to multinational. And so I'm not surprised that you have so many rich examples. And to be real for a minute, I'll also say multi-solving is still the exception and not the rule. And that's part of the purpose of Multisolving Institute, is to flip that script so that multi-solving becomes the predominant way of operating planetary wide. You can probably think of the obstacles, of the reasons why multi-solving is rare. And I imagine in your education and in your work in business, you've run into many of these. You know, I'll name a few of them. Mostly they're things that my mentor, Dana Meadows, called lines in the mind. Right? Things we've made up to divide the world into pieces. So in governments, there might be ministries. If you think about efforts governments undertake to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's probably a cost to the Ministry of Transportation and the Ministry of Energy, but it will have incredible benefits for the health of the people in that country, mostly from reduced air pollution, from less use of fossil fuels. In fact, the World Health Organization every year puts out a report that says the health benefits alone, the value of the health benefits alone matches the costs of a transition to meet climate goals. But back in this country, we're imagining the health minister is unlikely to be involved in transportation planning in most countries, and all those benefits accruing to the health ministry and the reduced costs of hospitalizations, for instance, are not necessarily credited to the transportation and energy ministers. So that's an example, but it goes all the way to organizations. I know many of you work in companies, large or small ones, where there's these same kind of ruptures that make it hard to find the multi-solving solution. Sometimes it's the difference between decisions that are made in a capital budget versus an operations budget. So most efficiency investments are capital expenses up front, and they save money on the operations budget. And it usually takes some creativity for people within those systems to put those incentives together to come up with the package or the way to move something forward. So I don't want to make multi-solving sound easier than it is. And I think we just all should give a lot of respect to the people who managed to pull it off.
Great. So just picking up on that theme, what could people here at the Sloan School of Management do in their thinking, in their practice, in the way they evaluate projects to overcome some of these barriers? Because I think the dilemma you're pointing out is a real one, right? A lot of these multi-solving projects, to put it in business terms, have positive net present value, create a lot of, have high rates of return, have short payback times, and they ought to be done, but they're often not. The classical objection when somebody says, here's a win-win solution, it's going to create these benefits, it's good economically for the company, is, well, you're omitting some of the costs or you're overestimating the benefits, because anything that's positive NPV should already be done. That's a classic kind of argument that you hear. So what can our folks here at the Sloan School of Management do to create the mindsets, the actions to overcome some of those barriers?
Yeah, fantastic question. And of course, because we all exist in different spheres and parts of our lives, you'll find opportunities to multi-solve as a citizen, as a neighbor, as part of a community in your private life. And then in your professional life, I believe you'll find opportunities to multi-solve both within your organization and by partnering with other organizations, other businesses, or some of the most powerful multi-solving is actually partners between civil society, governments, and businesses. Often they get called anchor institutions in this context, right? Who help bring these win-win solutions into being. The interesting thing is that my advice is basically the same, whichever sphere you're finding yourself thinking about, as an individual within your company or as you partner with other institutions. And that's because multi-solving, we say, is a way, not a what. It is generated by a way of being. And so one really cool thing is you can apply that way anywhere. So what are the elements of the multi-solving way? The most important one we've already been hinting about is the need to reach across and build trust and collaborate with other people. We say multi-solving moves at the speed of trust. So I'm sure all the skills that you brought with you before you enrolled at Sloan and things you're honing while you're there, the skills of listening, the skills of trust building, honestly, the skills of curiosity. One thing we find is that too much attachment to the role of the expert, too much identifying as an expert is actually inhibiting to multi-solving. We need everybody's expertise, but we need that kind of expert who's so curious about what they don't know and about how to bridge their language and their discipline with other languages and other disciplines. So curiosity, trust. We talk about solidarity, by which we mean the question, how can the solution to the problem that's keeping me up at night also be the solution to what's keeping you up at night? Maybe I'll say a little bit actually about the term multi-solving because it has bearing on this. There wasn't a word multi-solving until my colleagues and I kept running into the limitations of the existing terminology, which typically was to talk about co-benefits. And this, John mentioned a lot of my work in the space of global climate negotiations. In that context, people often talk about climate protection as the benefit, and that we should celebrate and take advantage of co-benefits, by which they often mean things like health improvements from reduced air pollution. But as we started to talk with people who weren't necessarily climate activists, we started to see that that was really an artificial distinction. And here's a thought experiment. Imagine that you're a parent of a kindergartner who's repeatedly in the emergency room because of her asthma. And there's a coal-fired power plant down the street from you. The climate advocates would say, shutting down that coal-fired power plant, that's a climate win with a health co-benefit. The parents of the kindergartner would probably say that's an air quality and health win with a climate co-benefit down the road. The point about multi-solving is that you don't need to choose which is the central benefit and which one is the nice to have benefit. Instead, you can put them all on a playing field, and that's this solidarity that now you're the climate activist who also is deeply committed to the health of kindergartners with asthma. And that kind of solidarity is what actually builds the power that allows vested systems to change. So we talk about transactional alliances, which don't have that depth of commitment to the needs and the concerns of others, versus solidarity, where you're really showing up not just for your own needs, but for the needs of others and other communities.
Can I just add a little bit? Because of what you just said, I learned from you and I have stopped using the term co-benefits in all of my climate work. And it's actually a little bit more than what you said, I think, because many of the community level people and the public health people and the doctors that I would talk to, and refer to the co-benefits of climate action, they felt, and some were willing to say it, but many of them felt that that framing was condescending and degraded and devalued them and their professions and their commitment to making a better world. And so I have absolutely stopped using the term co-benefits in everything that I do. And I think this idea is starting to spread even here at MIT.
Yeah, well said, John. The last thing I'll say that why I like multi-solving better than co-benefits is multi-solving is a verb, right? It acknowledges that it's something you do, not a result that you get. And I think it's just important to remember that. It's a skill you improve at, it's a skill you mess up at and try again the next day and the next day, because it's something you do and learn and grow into.
Could you give an example of that iterative learning as you go situation where maybe there was some sort of a crisis or just people recognized an opportunity and their initial attempts at multi-solving might not have been as successful as they wanted, but then they progressed and came to a better set of actions?
Yeah, that's such a common pattern that we see, that we really tell people to focus on starting where you are with less preoccupation on how big the challenge is. Here's an example that taught us about that. It's a program from New Zealand called Warm Up New Zealand. It was a response to a crisis. In this case, it was the 2008 financial crisis, which had put the construction trades out of work. And the ministry that was concerned with energy efficiency in New Zealand launched a program to weatherize and upgrade housing stock. So it was improving windows and insulation and boilers. And it was pretty successful. It got the construction trades to work, and it reduced energy use. It saved money for the people living in those homes. But here's where the learning and iteration came in. They decided to do a health impact assessment of the people living in those homes. And they found a really striking reduced visits to the emergency department and reduced medication costs for the people who are now living in improved, more comfortable, warmer housing. And in fact, those were on a dollar per dollar basis, those health savings were more significant, worth more money than the energy savings. And that led to a whole second round of the project where public health officials became involved, and then where doctors could refer patients for home energy upgrades. So that sense of you don't always start with all of the partners, but if you keep this wide scan for what else is changing as a result of what you're doing, you often will be led to other natural partners and more resources to expand the work.
Yeah, I love that example. And I just always love to visualize doctors prescribing you need insulation and better windows for your house, and that pays off. It's a great example. Maybe at this point, I have more questions, but maybe at this point, let's see what questions folks in the room have. Oh, we got hands up already. All right, go for it.
So thank you for sharing about this. I think it's a really exciting topic. It seems like a lot of us have done this at various points in our professional careers somewhere, but to do it systemically, what do you see as being the biggest opportunities for us to become aware of what co-benefits could be sought out of something? Because I think a lot of times it's very hard and very expensive to cross silos or to break them down. And then also, how do you see good structures for us sharing the costs of co-benefit related solutions? So that, for example, health funding could be collaboratively used to pay for home upgrades, So on both those sides, how do you find the ideas and then co-fund them better?
Yeah, I think those are both great questions. On the finding ideas, one obstacle, so I'm going to answer with the obstacle because that's what's coming first to mind. A challenge, we call multi-solving a hidden movement because it happens in so many different arenas, but the people doing it rarely know each other. And one thing we notice is even though multi-solvers are very much people-oriented network creators, they often tell us they feel alone in the way in which they're working, which we think is kind of an irony of this. So in our modest ways as an institute, that's one thing we're trying to address, is to help the multi-solvers of the world feel like they're a community, like this is a science and an art you can practice and get better at. So we offer webinars and other events, newsletters, ways for multi-solvers to learn from each other. And part of that is because, again, to this idea of the multi-solving way, you can be doing multi-solving work on walking and cycling and learn an awful lot from someone else who's working on food waste, right? It's not it's the way that you approach it. But before the efforts of our institute, there weren't necessarily places to learn from one another like that. So that's number one. How to find the math of the potential co-benefits and make the case, because often to get investment, you need to be able to do that, is another big challenge. Our effort toward that so far is an online app called Flower, and you can find it. Our website's multisolving.org. It's free and open to the public. It is a qualitative app to track 8 different co-benefits. It also has a customizable version where you can add your own co-benefits. And it's a tool for visualizing and I would say collective intelligence. So my best advice is to pool the people that have the knowledge, aim for one champion of every benefit, because none of you is going to know the full picture, but each of you knows part of it. And Flower is meant to make it a little easier to pool that knowledge. So what was your second question? Because it was good, but I forgot it.
No, I think you've kind of addressed it there. It's really just, the second part was, how do you get the funding to come together on that? Because if, healthcare, to your point, different ministries have different responsibilities. And if healthcare can't afford to pay for home upgrades alone, and also, the energy ministry can't afford to pay for that alone, but together there's enough co-benefit or multi-benefit that they can share it. How do you bring that money together? But I think you partially.
Yeah, well, actually, you make me want to name a really important challenge that you all actually have the skills to solve and is really needed, which is to address the time dimension of a lot of this. So I said the World Health Organization says that the benefits of getting off of fossil fuels for health outweigh or at least match the costs, which is true, but someone else's future not having asthma, right, or somebody not having cardiovascular disease from air pollution is not actually readily available money to go buy a solar panel with, right? So it requires financing mechanisms that I think people are just beginning to figure out, that to build the partnerships where the future costs to the health system or to insurance companies actually are a source of revenue or a source of capital for making the investments that are needed. But those are, people are only just beginning to experiment with that. I think there's a lot of need to crack that nut.
Go ahead.
Question about solution. This concept is really interesting for multi-solving, but like, for example, there are 3 startups that are involved in the same irrigation system and save this and that amount of money. How do you, with this concept, how do you attribute for each one of the startups the impact measure or outcome measure? Because they need to report, right? And they need to raise money based off of their impact and outcome measures. So how
Are in what you're imagining, the 3 startups are doing the same thing and they're competitors? Is that what you mean?
No, they're in the same irrigation system, for example, in a rice field, and each one of them is responsible for something else in the irrigation system, but they're all saving money or water on the same system. So do you attribute to each one of the 3 the same amount of water saved, or the fractional amount? How do you attribute? That's my
Yeah,
question.
I mean, I don't think there's one answer, and that's why this again comes to convening and trust building and conversation. And to think about water and expand that a little bit. There's so many cases with climate change, there's increased flooding in urban areas. And often the most cost-effective prevention measure is upstream, is to invest in conservation and wetlands to slow the water at the source. The potential damage, the resources to solve the problem are in a whole different municipality than the top of the watershed where the conservation efforts could happen. And so there are examples again, but they're always so arduous and so slow, and they depend on particular people with skills and, basically not giving up, right? There isn't this easy pathway to make those matches. So yeah, my best answer is you have to figure it out, and it depends on people. I wish it was easier.
Other questions? And Beth, feel free to call on people. How about online, Emma?
We just got one from Felicitas. When you think about implementing multi-solving solutions at scale, and you think of the low-hanging fruit, for example, solutions that are established and have the right cost structure, do we need business to bring them to scale, or government? And if the latter, which level of government, local, regional, national? It sounds as if many solutions need a mixed approach, which makes coordination more difficult.
Yeah, well, hi, Felicity. Fun to see your name there. So my answer to this question is based on our approach, which has been to look at the bright spots, to look at the success stories around the world, and then ask, how did people do it? And what you're hinting at, I think, is right, that some of the most inspiring examples do have this multi-level coordination. There's a federal partner, a local partner, a nonprofit partner, and a business. To see this, go to our website again, multisolving.org, where we've written up these case studies. There's, I think, a power and a resilience to that. And as Felicitas is naming, it can be slower to get there. The question I always ask people, though, is, are these siloed approaches as efficient as we think? Are we getting the scale of change that we actually need? Because people will say, oh, it takes too long to listen, all this listening, all this coordination. But think about if you know of projects that were really fast but didn't have buy-in, and maybe what happened next, because systems lash back, they lash out at changes that aren't supported by everyone in the system. And I think people neglect that when they think narrow approaches are faster. The other thing I'd say that those of us in the US are grappling with right now is when there's a sudden default by one of these sets of partners, in this case, the federal government, pulling out of many multi-solving initiatives. I think people are really glad that there's philanthropy, state and local and business interests. There's a resiliency to that. So again, in those moments where you're like, this is so hard, there's so much listening, so much convening, consider what you might be getting out of that willingness to do that slow tending process.
Well, More questions? I have more, but I'd love to hear from the group. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks for being here. Something about this that's interesting to me is I imagine there are many people who are unwittingly pursuing a multi-solving approach to problem solving. Like this sounds of I can imagine folks just sort of naturally gravitating towards this rather than a more adversarial approach to problem solving. I'm curious what people's reactions are when you introduce this framework to them, and maybe they'd already been working on it a little bit, like whether they grasp it, they understand it. And then also conversely, when you introduce this, if you have introduced this framework to people that were not receptive to it or pushed back or challenged it, and why that was and sort of what that dialogue was like.
Yeah. Yeah, well, we are very humble. I am, and we as an institute, we never act as though or assert that multi-solving is something we invented. We feel like what we do is hold up a mirror to something that exists. And I think I mentioned, I think of it as a hidden movement, and it often seems to feel like a gift to people. We really often hear, I've been doing this my whole life, but I didn't really know there was a word for it. Didn't know there were other people doing this. You know, people feel like they've invented it and figured it out by trial and error, this way of working. And of course, I've mentioned crises a few times. The other main driver of multi-solving is scarcity, right, of resources. I think of, you know, my grandmother who lived through the Depression was a natural multi-solver who could squeeze a lot out of a little. So it's not this necessarily highfalutin, academically credentialed way of operating. And also many other wisdom traditions on the planet, and definitely indigenous ways of knowing and acting are multi-solving. So yeah, definitely want to say that the humility of not thinking we're bringing something to the world as much as bringing something to light. I would say we rarely get direct confrontation that multi-solving is a bad idea, you know, because I think it probably because it is so common and familiar. And there's other kinds of resistance, though. And to the question just from a few minutes ago about convening many different factors, maybe I'll just give you an example. This is a few years ago in a US state, and we had an ally who was part of a newly appointed governor's task force on, it was time to update the state's climate plan. And this ally was all about multi-solving. She thought this was the perfect opportunity. She wanted to bring our team in to help them do that. And they had this, I mean, it was so perfect, right? They had transportation and housing and health. It was really a broad set of cabinet officials who were going to draft this climate plan. And the governor handed responsibility to the plan to deliver the plan and a very tight timeline to someone in the Department of Environmental Protection. And that person said no, like no to us joining, no to multi-solving, no to including a wider sphere of benefits. And it was because her job depended on delivering a plan by a date, and she felt the skills and support to hold what she perceived as a more complicated process. So that kind of like resistance by attrition, by not trying, is probably the most common thing we run into.
So just to follow up on that, you mentioned a couple times that crises can stimulate multi-solving, but often in a crisis, there's a felt need for immediate action. And I remember very clearly after Hurricane Irene devastated Vermont, and there's been several other devastating storms since then, you and others up in the multi-solving community said, let's rebuild Vermont. Let's rebuild the roads and the bridges that were wiped out to have more bike lanes, for example. And that didn't happen in most cases. So there seems like a tension between the role of a crisis in stimulating multi-solving efforts that have clear benefits for many, and the time pressure that you just described in the example where the person in charge didn't feel there was enough time to do it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a completely true tension, and it's understandable, right? I mean, when in this case in Vermont, right, people couldn't get to school, ambulances couldn't get to communities. The pressure to rebuild is real, and lives depend on it sometimes. And the opportunity to rebuild better and smarter can be squandered. I don't have an answer to what to do about that beyond really stressing pre-thinking so that the plans are there, knowing that in a moment of crisis, there's potential to do things differently. We're now more than 10 years out from that initial Hurricane Irene, and so we can see some interesting things that were multi-solving that came out of a crisis. One is they're called Irene cottages, and it was a collaboration of philanthropy, architects, the building community, who noticed that a lot of the housing that was destroyed in floodplains was manufactured homes, the kind of low-cost housing stock. It was very energy inefficient, and they came up with a design to move out of the floodplain and build homes with a similar footprint, but much more energy efficient. And we were talking about financing. They came up with a financing mechanism. The homes are more expensive slightly, but their operating costs, their utility bills would be less. And so they came up with a financing mechanism so people could afford those homes. And my understanding is that they shared all those plans, and they've been used in other places around the country. And I don't know the full story of what made that happen. I'm curious about it, whether it was individuals who saw a moment. I believe there was groundwork in place, and people starting to think about this problem of energy inefficient housing in floodplains ahead of time.
Yeah, the key point there is you can multi-solve in advance so that you're ready when that opportunity presents itself. I think that's very important. Michael?
Yeah. Oh, John, actually, one other important thing about that is what people see in multi-solving are the bike lanes and the urban orchards, the insulated homes. But there's another trace that's left behind that's probably more important. And I call that rewired systems. It's the connections between people and silos that persists, that were created to get that bike lane built, but they still are there. And they're a resource that can be self-organized in a moment of crisis. And Vermont has a good story of that as well. The response to Irene was really hampered because it affected multiple towns, multiple agencies. Communication wasn't very good. And people started meeting across all these agencies in order to make the recovery even feasible. So there was a lot of work over several years that built those connections. And then that whole connection kind of went dormant until 2020 and COVID-19, when it sprung back to life in the just disaster response now to the pandemic. So totally different disaster, but those relationships were there. Went dormant again until 2023 and then 2024 when we had 2 more flooding events. And that's now where the disaster response is coming from. So
Great.
if you're doing this work, remember you're building the immediate thing in front of you, and you're rewiring systems to be more responsive to threats.
Michael, did you have a?
Yeah. Thanks a lot for being here. I never heard of the term multi-solving, but have been lucky enough to get to work on some projects that I'm realizing included a lot of what you're talking about. And one of them was getting basically a city funding youth to work on a program planting trees all around the city, which ended up being a collaboration, like everyone from the police department, because teen jobs mean less crime over the summers, to Health and Human Services, because more trees is part of their 30-year plan to decrease air pollution, et cetera. So there are times where it's obvious that everyone can win, but it also seems like one of the things that's really hard to get around is that the quick solution is often the politically popular one, both politics by definition, but also in organizations, political action and whatnot. So how much time do you spend talking about and thinking about like basically convincing people not to take the quick and easy path, like the EPA right now. Cheaper energy. Who doesn't want to hear that? But it'll have long-term effects, and those are just really hard to articulate and to prove to people. So how much of your work is around like the political factors of all of this?
Yeah, well, actually, one of the experiences that led me to think about multi-solving was frustration in addressing climate change as a 50 to 100-year problem that had to do with CO2. And there was a moment, I write about this in the book, that crystallized that for me, where young, earnest computer modeler, I got one of the negotiators to the UN. I pulled her aside in the line for coffee. I was like, what could we add to our models, that would increase the negotiators' room to act? And I was like, what if we added flooding? What if we added, new viruses? And she kind of patted me on the shoulder and she said, the only thing that influences how far we go as negotiators is how far can we go before the president or prime minister is going to lose the next election, right? And so her reality was, this was about sacrifice and what people were, how far they could go. But we knew that things that were much more short term than climate change would get better really quickly within the term of elected officials, like air pollution. That's going to improve much more quickly. And not seeing air pollution as connected to climate change, I believe, is part of what limited the room for moving on climate. So what we're trying to encourage people to do is bundle together solutions that will show up in the short term and solutions for the long term, especially things like climate change, where success just looks like things getting worse more slowly than they otherwise would have. That's what the reality is at this point. So I think it's what you're thinking about is really important. And I hope that answer made some sense.
Alexander?
So we've talked a lot about how there might be benefits in a lot of different areas, but how do you think about the fact that there might be massive costs in one particular area, right? So like in climate change mitigation, it has all these benefits, the environment and health and so on, but then it also reduces obviously demand for oil and gas, and that industry often provides really well-paying jobs in areas that often don't have a better alternative. So those people are very massive costs. How do you guys think about that?
Yeah. So I mentioned briefly the FLOWER tool. FLOWER stands for the Framework for Long-Term Whole System Equity-Based Reflection. It also looks like a flower, and each petal is a different benefit. And we realized, so I should say FLOWER is designed by multi-solvers. Like, we did an iterative process where we asked people what they needed in order to make more progress multi-solving. And this trade-offs question you're naming was part of it. So in FLOWER, you can both show the size of an expected benefit, but also the decrease in benefit, or even the increase in a burden. And the point of doing that is so people can have the conversation. We think of it in the framework of what's sometimes called a just transition when it comes to climate change, which is, what are the transitional policies to help those communities who are going to have a burden as a result of a change that's overall better for the whole system. And the second question, I think it's embedded in what you're asking, is to track where those benefits and where those burdens land. Because in an inequitable society, often it's not fairly distributed unless you design your policy to address historic inequities. So that might mean, how do you make sure that women have access to jobs in a new energy sector? Or how do you make sure that the pollution that comes from creating solar panels isn't going to affect a marginalized community? So FLOWER won't answer those questions, but it will make them visible. And our goal is always to have people improve their thinking to address those downsides of change or downsides of progress.
Yeah, Emma.
Online questions. Susanna asked, what is your view on externalities and internalizing externalities? We still use GDP as a measure of progress. And efforts like the NGFS climate scenarios help analyze impact of climate in the financial systems. Should we try to integrate externalities to change the system from within?
Yeah, great question. And of course, with mentors like Donella Meadows and John Sterman, internalizing externalities has always been a policy I've advocated for. It's a way to make systems work better. And what I've had to face over the years is that impacts are externalized because of power, right? Externalizing something says the people this harms don't matter, right? Whether that's the people in the future or the people in the fence line communities. And so I used to think of this as more analytical, we just need to design these systems and it's a matter of policy, but it really is a matter of power. And so another reason we're proponents of multi-solving is that it's a way to build power to shift vested interests, the ones who want those impacts to stay externalized. And so one way I explain this and the way it first hit me was a pie chart of all the costs of the use of fossil fuel. This was research of Paul Ehrlich and his team. And each impact was a wedge of the pie chart. And the wedge called climate change wasn't even the biggest wedge of pie, right? There was impacts on the health of people in Appalachia. There was air pollution. There was the effects on militarization and war. And I just realized each of those wedges was a different community. They were educated in a different discipline. They thought they were fighting a different fight. And you can be sure the fossil fuel companies are really glad that we treat those all as separate issues because we're weaker piece by piece. So yes, for internalizing things to make systems operate better, but I invite you to consider to what extent is that actually about power and the needs for coalitions to create change.
So we have a couple minutes left and I have one more question. So the second last chapter in the book is called Multi-Solving in Tumultuous Times. And you wrote that before the election in November. And there was plenty of tumult then. Whatever one's politics, there's a lot more tumult now in the world. What advice have you got for our folks here who are mostly business students and come from the business community and mostly will go back into the business world, but who are also citizens and want to participate in creating a better world for themselves, their kids, and for all the kids? What advice have you got for us?
Yeah. Yeah, I think about this a lot, and partly because with my mentors being part of the group who wrote The Limits to Growth in 1972, their work really made clear if the world didn't change fundamental things, the 2020s were going to be challenging. And here we are. So I've mentioned already multi-solving as a response to crisis. I find that heartening in that I think there's a kind of creativity that does arise in difficult times. Another thing I think about is designing our lives and our systems with more slack in them. At Multisolving Institute, we say a controversial thing. Not all our donors are happy to hear it, but we say we don't ever set goals that we have to be at a full out sprint all the time to accomplish. Because we don't think in that world we're going to be able to do that. And we're finding it true. This year our team was impacted by the hurricanes in the Southeast. A few years ago, we were all impacted by COVID. So we build in slack. And I would encourage you to think about that in terms of time, in terms of inventory. Just-in-time inventory isn't great for a world of supply chain disruption, yet we've honed so many systems to be quite brittle in that way. So think about what definition of efficiency will serve you in more disrupted times. And two last things. So remember that crisis can create creativity, build in some slack, cultivate what we call coherence, which means systems where all the parts are aligned in the vision of where you're going and the values of who you are. Because in tumultuous times, you're going to find, I believe, that top-down control is going to fray. You're going to be in moments when you have to improvise and you can't talk to the home office. If you know what you stand for and you know where you want to go, you're going to be better positioned for that. And the last thing I would name is no regrets actions. And we understand this individually, right? If I told you tomorrow was going to be a really challenging day, but you didn't know whether it was going to be a really hard test or you were going to get a flat tire, on Route 93, you could still do things today to increase your odds that that would be okay tomorrow, right? What would you do? You'd get good sleep. You'd eat good food. You'd probably spend time with the people that you love so that you're in a positive frame of mind. I think in crisis, all those things, the no regrets in actions, and they're so for individuals, but for the planet too, right? Invest in the health of ecosystems. No matter what, that's going to serve you, no matter what shocks are coming.
Great. So that's wonderful advice. And I would just add that when you do those things, you're going to have more fun and it'll be more personally rewarding for you. Just that process. Beth, thank you so much for joining us today. I highly recommend the book. Thanks to our online folks and everybody who showed up today.
Thanks, everyone. Really enjoyed your questions and your spirit. Thanks for having me.